All right. We are now live streaming through YouTube. Welcome anybody who is watching this video later or right now as I speak. For those of you who are just joining me, my name is Nathan Nguyen. I am the Director of LBGT Student Services. Pronouns I use are he, him, his. Um, and I will be presenting a little bit about the overlap of racialized gender roles and also for stuff around Asian American identity. Asian American history normally celebrated in May, but of course, this school year ends in April. So, what's an Asian American person to do? So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen here. And as usual, for those of you who are joining us live in this webinar, you're welcome to put questions in the chat. If you have the option, or if you have the feature in your WebEx, you can also click on the closed captioning, and I'll have it on YouTube where it should be auto closed caption. So there's that. So go ahead and make sure I optimize. Okay, everybody. Well, actually, okay, everybody see that okay? Make faces at me if you do have issues. Okay, so um, before I get started, I want to do a land recognition. And one of my colleagues, Romeo, they, them, theirs, um, brought this quote to me. And this is, from a two-spirit indigenous person. If you are reading this in the United States or Canada, whose land are you on, dear reader? What are the specific names of the native nations that have historical claim to the territory on which you currently read this article? What are their histories before European invasion? What are their historical and present acts of resistance to colonial occupation? If you're like most people in the United States and Canada, you cannot answer these questions. And this disturbs me. Oh, we're having some mic issues. I'll get to that here. Let me try. Sorry, y'all. Let me see if I can try to figure out this mic. How about this mic? Is that better? Is the computer microphone better, or is the this microphone better? Somebody say something in the chat. Okay, so that's odd. I'll have to troubleshoot later. Current one. Okay, current. All right. So apologies for that. Okay, apparently I sound like a robot with the other microphone. Good to know. I'll try to troubleshoot that later. Put the chat again. Anytime you share your screen on WebEx, the chat disappears. So again, reminder, if you don't know what Indigenous people are doing right now to fight colonization, that is troublesome, that is worrisome. So this goes beyond just acknowledging the land we are on. All right, so why we're here. One is to engage in dialogue around cisgender constructs, both Asian and American. And I have an asterisk by Asian because it is very broad definition, as you can see by the map in the lower right-hand corner. We have East, we have Southeast, we have West, we have South, we have North. And so it's very broad when we say Asian, right? The other is to get a better understanding of gender norms. Everybody has been, socialized in different ways around gender, right? How subconscious actions may perpetuate gender and or racial stereotypes, and how all of this impacts LGBTQ identities. So a reminder that gender is less of a binary, it's less this and more of like a spectrum. And then there are some folks who don't want to be on the piece of paper that is holding the gender construct altogether, right? So here are some common terms. This is not a comprehensive list, but these are some common terms that I'll be using. Assimilation, diaspora, the white racial frame, perpetual foreigner, model minority myth, xenophobia, hypersexualization or desexualization. APIDA is one of many acronyms for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American. There's also API, which is Asian American Pacific Islander. Microaggressions, Dragon Lady or Tiger Mom, yellow fever, and then in this day and age, we have dating apps. So unfortunately, there are some folks out there who are just awful and say things on their dating app saying no spice, no rice, no fats, no femmes, and that sort of language, right? So really excluding anybody who does not fit within a specific body type or gender expression or a racial identity. So gender and race. When I started doing this presentation, I kept going back and forth of what should I put first, the gender or the race? And it's very interesting because when I asked this question for a class, we have to understand that everybody comes to these different identities at different times. So understand that gender is a system of social control, and that race is also a system of social control. And then when you put those two together, you have a racialization of gender roles at intersecting systems of oppression. So what does that look like? And I had to ask students this because it's been well over 20 years since I've taken chemistry. I was like, what is this called again? What are these things that are moving around? I don't get it. But your core, what takes place in the center? What is most precedent for you? What is as far as your different facets of identities? Because remember, people have more than one identity. So they could be anything from race, gender, culture, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic class, and faith, right? So these protons and electrons and things that are constantly moving, again, we're looking at different facets of your identity that may take more precedence than others. So I'll use myself as an example. Me working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, sometimes even longer hours. My full-time position centers around LGBTQ identity. So oftentimes I'm focusing a lot on sexual orientation and gender identity. And then there are other times where maybe my race and my ethnicity will take more precedence. So my race, I am Asian American. My ethnicity, both of my parents are Vietnamese. And so sometimes that will take more precedence. And then there are other times where those identities will literally crash into each other. So an example would be if I attended a conference and there was a workshop about being Asian American, and another workshop about being a trans man, and another workshop about, I don't know, working in higher education or something like that. But all three of those workshops are offered at the same time in different parts of the building. Which one do I choose? And I also would be remiss, this is an artwork that came, for those of you who aren't familiar, about last year in the wake of anti-Asian hate. I believing that COVID was coming from Asian populations, a elderly Asian woman was attacked and she was prepared. She had a cricket bat. And so she fought back when a guy tried to assault her, right? And so this was a groundswell where some folks created this image, and it benefited an organization that she chose to combat Asian hate. All right, so I know not everybody in the audience identifies as Asian, but these are some things that come up commonly, and it's not universal for any Asian American. But some stereotypes, the yellow peril, model minority myth, and perpetual foreigner. So yellow peril, for those of you who aren't familiar, this belief that, when imperialism and colonization was happening, particularly out in Western United States, there was, again, this narrative that don't let the foreigners, quote unquote, take our jobs, right? And so those of you who are unaware in history, the Transcontinental Railroad was predominantly built by Chinese laborers, particularly Chinese men, right? So this yellow peril of, the Asians are coming, the Chinese are coming, they're going to steal our jobs, they're going to steal our women, et cetera, right? There's also the perpetual foreigner. This is another stereotype that no matter how many times Asian folks assimilate and to the majority culture, they are always seen as a foreigner. So I'll use myself as an example. Again, for my features, my hair and my skin tone and my eyes, so on and so forth, I can't tell you how many times a microaggression would come up of, wow, you speak really great English. And I say, wow, I was born in Kansas City, right? So again, no matter how many times I have to reiterate, I am an American citizen, born and bred, there's still this perception that I came from somewhere else. And then the model minority myth. This is the model minority is a term actually that was coined by sociologists in the 1960s. And this was, again, this perception that at first it was for the Chinese and then later the Japanese, and then it got interchangeable for all Asians, saying that the Asians are hardworking, studious, don't start trouble, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was this very strange double-edged narrative of racism can't exist because the Asians are doing well, which is, false. Or if racism did exist, then how come the Asians are doing well? Again, completely false, right? These are really dangerous stereotypes because what happens is it flattens the entire Asian American community. Because remember, we're not all from one country. We're all from different countries, different faith backgrounds, different points of history with European colonization. We have a lot of different things that we have going on in our different identities. So, and what? Okay. Sorry, y'all. This is the link to the Jones-McEwen model in case you're curious about that. I'll put this back to full screen. No, don't do that. Okay. All right. So yes, the model minority myth, unfortunately, is still perpetuated a lot. There's some historical context, and I can talk about that later at a different time. We're kind of on a time crunch, but there's a reason why there are some, not all, but some Asian American communities that seem more well off than others. And that goes back to immigration laws, privilege, and selection by the United States, as well as Japanese internment, which led to another domino effect. But this is actually an actual Time cover magazine that came out in 1980s. Again, just further perpetuating that all Asians are great. They don't do anything bad, quote unquote. So very anti-Black narratives, very problematic. So some of the microaggressions that are out there. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. Some of the microaggressions. What are you? Where are you from? Where are you really from? And so these are, again, some microaggressions that continue to happen and keep coming up. And it's just very odd, right? That, again, I always have to constantly defend my Americanness, or that I am really from here, right? Or that I don't, eat anybody's pets. That's not a thing, right? So this comes up, and this is an article from Johnson and Guerrero, specifically this model here. This think of this as a clock. You have your hour hand, your minute hand, and your second hand. So this really is breaking down race and ethnicity, right? So you have these external questions of identity. What are you? What group do you belong to? Who are you and where are you from, right? And so the hour hand, as I said earlier, my race is Asian American, right? Um, and then, my ethnicity, that's the minute hand, right? Is, that I am Vietnamese. Anybody else having audio issues? I see in the chat that somebody's having audio issues. Okay. Audio is fine on other people's. Okay, so thank you all. Oh yeah, try switching your speaker. Thank you, Lindsay. So as I was saying, my race is Asian American. My ethnicity is I am Vietnamese. Both of my parents are from South Vietnam. And then my culture, well, this could be a variety of things, right? It could be my faith identity. It could be a specific region that my parents come from. And so, like, again, these are things that are constantly moving. So if we were to look at that the Jones and McEwen model that looked like the chemistry molecule, this is if we zoomed in even more on race and ethnicity and culture, right? And so this is something that Johnson Guerrero came up with for Asian American identity development. So some reflection here. You could put it in the chat. Which identity were you made aware of first? Was it your gender, your race, or something else? And put that in chat. Okay, gender, race. Think it was gender. Gender, yeah. Okay, gender. Yeah, for folks, it can be a mix, right? Some folks say gender, other folks say race. For me personally, I will speak from my own experience. Yeah, somebody else said religion, right? For my own experience, I think I was made aware of my race, right? Because my parents and their friends who looked like them spoke one language, but then everybody else outside in our neighborhood spoke a different language. So I was made more aware of that than I was gender. Who made you aware of this identity? Was it your family? Was it your community? And this could be a community, could be your faith identity or the community that you lived in. Or was it the media? Was it music? Was it movies? Was it TV? So who made you aware of the first identity that you self-actualized? And you can go ahead and put that in the chat too. Family. Thank you, Sherry. Family, right? Yeah, that's a real one. The dangers, quote unquote, of being assigned female at birth, right? Family and community. Yep. Community. Yeah. Community. So for those of us, oh yeah, combination. Oh, we got the combo punch. Okay. So for some of us, particularly if we came from a community or an area or media representation where we did not see ourselves, this is very much a thing that is very noticeable, right? So again, I'll speak from my own experience as a child that was born in the 80s and raised in the 80s. There was no representation of what it meant to be Asian American in TV or movies at that time. And that's another story too, because there was a 20-year gap at one point. Or that, community, family definitely kind of reinforced like, hey, you're this gender, you're supposed to act this way. or be aware of your surroundings, et cetera, right? So hopefully you keep thinking about that. Like, what are the messages that you received? And if you're in the majority population, if you are maybe white identified and lived in a white community, and then we know that media representation tends to skew more white. Um, when did you start realizing that, hey, you're in the majority, right? So something to think about. So part one, things to think about. When did you first notice race? And you don't have to give me an exact age, right? So for yourself, when did you first notice race? For your own racial identity and also the racial identity of others around you. And again, if you feel comfortable, go ahead and put it in chat. About to begin school, yeah. Race and racism always discussed in the home as a child, elementary school probably, as a young child, yeah. So then as we're thinking about race, who kept reinforcing the messages regarding race in your life? Was it family, friends, community, and school? And then as far as the messages regarding race or races, because again, America is a variety of different races, were the messages positive, negative, a mix? We got very negative, mix. And that's something to think about. Who in your world was putting these messages, and who of those messages, which of them were positive, negative, or a mix, right? Or neutral. All right. Now, switching gears, let's take the race hat off, set it aside. We'll come back to the race hat. We'll put it back on later. I promise we will. What about gender? Let's put the gender hat on. I don't know what the gender hat would look like, but you can use your imagination. When did you first notice gender? For your own gender identity, as well as for others? As a child again, toddler, childhood, very young. And then again, think about who was kind of policing or reinforcing messages around gender. Yep. That life of being assigned female at birth, getting a lot of dresses, right? Yep. Very much also the danger of being again assigned female at birth, right? Mostly community. Appreciate everyone sharing. Yeah, right. So again, I'll use myself as an example. My mother, having been assigned female, like myself being assigned female at birth, my mother was very reinforcing, like girls should not play with cars, girls should play with dolls, right? So that was to me, that my perception for me was very negative, right? Which is unfortunate, right? All right, so now if we put those two things together, so let's take the gender hat and the race hat and put them on, try to put them on at the same time, right? Or if you want, you could put them side by side and then see what happens when you mash the two together. And again, you could put this in the chat. We don't have to do it as a group discussion. Think of the norms that you were raised in or stereotypes around your race. And again, also stereotypes or norms that you were raised in regarding the sex that you were assigned at birth. So I'll use myself as an example. My racialized identity, I am Asian, right? And so some stereotypes are the model minority myth, right? That I don't cause trouble, that I don't raise my voice, I don't fight, right? Then my assigned sex at birth, I was assigned female. That women are not combative, apparently. That's the stereotype, right? That we're told not to take up space, right? Then when we combine the two, what happens? So again, using myself as an example, being assigned female at birth and being Asian American, there is very much a stereotype that Asian women are hypersexualized, that they are quote unquote the perfect girlfriend. There's also stereotypes about genitalia, which is awful, and I don't want to repeat it because it's just completely untrue. Um, and this is something that was to be desired from other races outside of the Asian race, right? Anybody else want to share in the chat? Any reflections that come up when you overlap these two things for yourself? Again, you don't have to. As a Black woman, you were told you were not the image of beauty. Thank you for sharing that. As a Mexican American woman, there is an over sexualization because of the part of the media. Yes, definitely. Yeah, everyone assumes I'm going to be rude, or as a child, it's not beautiful, right? And so, yeah, these are things that everybody who has a racialized identity and assigned sex at birth, and norms that we've been kind of forced into, whether we liked it or not, you have to navigate. So, what if we put it all together? Now I'm making you come up with formulas. Now we went from a Venn diagram to formulas. So let's put it, race plus gender equals what, right? So a racial stereotype. So racial stereotype, again, I'll speak from my own experience. The racial stereotype is that we are, Asians are quiet, we don't start trouble, we're the good, quote unquote, the good ones, right? A gender stereotype, women are weaker, that they're not supposed to take up space and that sort of thing, right? So what is the outcome? What were some things that I was doing either consciously or subconsciously to say, hey, I'm here, I'm not going to fall into either one of those stereotypes or both of those stereotypes, right? So the outcome of the race and gender stereotypes is that, unfortunately, the male gaze towards Asian women is very hypersexualized, right? So maybe a subconscious action for my race is that, I will speak up more, right? Or for my gender, I'll try to take up more space. Um, and that was more of a conscious thing or a subconscious thing. Again, folks are welcome to share in the chat anything they just realized as far as their subconscious or conscious behaviors that they were doing to try to combat those stereotypes. Actively avoided wearing any pink or any dresses to be less girly. Right, thank you for sharing. Right? And that was a conscious gender action, right? That this person just put in the chat. Anybody else want to share? Wore bright colors and refused to be quiet or small. Thank you. Yeah. And so these are things that we either consciously or subconsciously are doing. And I didn't realize it until I took a workshop similar to this one. And then somebody pointed out in the audience, I'm tired. It's exhausting to try to combat these stereotypes all the time, right? So before, actually ended up identifying as trans in some form for 3 years now. How much was disgusted by female gender roles? Yes, female gender roles are very strict. Actually, any gender role is strict, right? And we could talk more about that as well. So if we're talking about these things, we haven't even factored in if an LGBTQ Asian American is navigating these things as well. So now we add in sexual orientation and also gender identity. So these are, again, I can share this Google presentation later, but there's some links here to some YouTube videos. This is a comedy video. This one's kind of funny. But this is what I was referring to earlier, like the rumor or the stereotype that Asian women's genitalia is much better than anybody other races, and it's just really gross, and it's just like, okay. So these are things that come up, right? I also see this. The last institution I worked at, I noticed that some of the Asian American guys were really trying to combat the stereotype of Asian men are not alpha, that they're weak, that they're not masculine. So then I saw these guys who were really going hard on like, oh, I'm going to be the gem bro, or I'm going to be the frat bro. Or those of you aren't familiar, ASEAN or Asian guys, that's more of like, like the quote unquote, the ghetto Asian. And again, this is not terminology I normally use, or Asian guys from the inner city. So these are things that some of the guys really try to combat, right? I have in the comment here that somebody used to hide from the sun to keep their skin fair, even though they loved the sun. And, again, another stereotype that I thought I was a tomboy because I preferred wearing pants, right? So again, these are stereotypes that all of us are combating in different ways, either consciously or subconsciously. So these are some additional videos. The one on the left about Asian American men is, more informational. It's from NBC Asian America. And then on the one on the right is Christina Wong. She is a comedian. She's really funny. And so again, this is several years back. I got to hear her speak. I'll play a brief clip of the Christina Wong video.
Are you interested in all this? Not as interested as you could be. A new dating app called Are You Interested has released data showing their users' racial preferences. And here's the deal. All men except Asian men preferred Asian women, making Asian women the most desired racial group among heterosexual men. As for the ladies, all racial groups except Black women preferred white men. Black men and Black women received the lowest response rates on the application and tend to seek each other out. And here's the most interesting piece of all. The data revealed that men across racial groups preferred a race outside of their own. We're joined now by Josh Fisher, the director of product insight at Are You Interested, the app we just spoke about. He joins us from New York. We also have comedian and blogger Christina Wong joining us from LA. All right, thank you both so much for joining us.
Hi, great to be here.
All right, Josh, when you look at this data, do you feel it accurately reflects America's racial preferences?
Yeah, I think, when we looked at over 2 million interactions for the way that people actually behave in real life, not just the way that they say they would behave. And what we were shocked by was that this really is the kind of the way things are now. People have a lot less prejudice when it comes to who they decide they want to respond to in an online dating context.
Christina, does the female Asian preference make you want to dust your shoulder off or give a big eye roll?
At first it was sort of upsetting because I feel like it just feeds into this the fetishization of Asian women and the sort of the stereotype that Asian women are these submissive, delicate, model girlfriend types. But as I thought about it, I took a moment and I was like, suck it, white ladies. I got it. I had to live under your shadow all through high school, and now I'm the hottest thing on earth, and I can do anything, and some crazy white guy will still like this.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I include that clip, because she's hilarious. I got to hear her speak as a keynote. She goes on in that video. So again, you're welcome to look that up on YouTube but it's a little bit dated. Yeah, you know, it kind of gives the context of what Asian women go. So Asian women are hypersexualized and fetishized, and then Asian men are desexualized and not desired at all. So Christina actually did some really funny things. If you all remember years ago when Jeremy Lin made a really big name for himself in the NBA, she took it upon herself to do kind of like a social media campaign of like Jeremy Lin marry me, to kind of show like, hey, Asian men are also desirable. It was a little wild and out there, but it was really funny. So anyway. All right, so we've talked about race, we've talked about gender, and now we're talking about sexual orientation and or gender identity expression. And I know for some folks, it doesn't bode well to mash sexual orientation and gender identity together. But again, we're kind of limited on time. So again, if you feel comfortable in the chat, when did you first notice either sexual orientation or gender identity and expression? For yourself or for others? Late elementary, gender expression in preschool, sexual orientation more like middle school, around middle school, question mark, yeah. Yeah. Middle school, yeah. So I noticed everyone had crushes, and everyone had crushes and would get excited about things I couldn't understand. Late elementary for someone else. Yeah. Middle school, first sex ed class. Oh boy. They gave a disclaimer that they were not allowed to talk about LGBT topics. Middle school. Yeah. So again, I'll talk about my own experiences. My parents, I wasn't really made aware of non-heterosexual identities or non-cisgender identities until my parents talked badly about a lesbian that they saw at like a Vietnamese wedding, right? And that already reinforced the message that if you're not heterosexual, if you're not cisgender, that's bad, right? Some in the chat here in middle school, I would choose a boy to have a crush on so I could talk about it like the other girls. Yeah, definitely. I'll disclose that my wife, she dated a guy in middle school and throughout high school and a little bit of early college because that's what all the other girls did, right? And she's like, oh, I guess I'm supposed to date guys too, and never really questioned other options, right? Even though her parents were the most accepting parents in the neighborhood, right? So we put that all together. We have stereotypes, right? So we have stereotypes about race, we have gender, and LGBTQ. So stereotype, again, this could be media representation or messages that are out there. So again, the messages that I heard a lot about LGBTQ identities that I do not agree with included, oh, that's bad. That's not normal, quote unquote. You're not supposed to be this way, right? And so like a subconscious action would be that I did for myself. It's like, oh, I'm not supposed to walk this way, or I'm not supposed to be attracted to certain genders, right? And then, so that would, that was the subconscious. I didn't say it out loud, right? But these are things that like I'm very hyper aware of for myself, right? And so the conscious actions and behaviors that I had to do to combat that were very much like an extra exercise, right? that I had to do that I didn't need to do. So again, I know I'm talking about Asian American identities here, but again, everybody has a racialized identity. Everybody has a gender socialized identity of some sort. And so these are things to think about for yourself. So we put that all together, particularly, so again, I'll use myself as an example. Race, that, Asian Americans are, not loud and that sort of thing. Gender, women are not supposed to be loud or not take up space. And then like, we'll take the lesbian identity, right? The lesbian identity that are like hypersexualized, or that, they hate men and that sort of thing. These are, again, messages I do not agree with, but they're messages that are floating out around there. And then you put all that together, what does that create as far as actions? And this is a really quick slide because this is more historical context of the Asian American identity. I mentioned earlier that there's a reason why certain Asian communities, maybe, or families, I should say, are doing better than others. And that was because pre-1965, immigration laws at that time really favored those who came from money, who had education, who had something that they could contribute to the US economy, right? And not only that, but immigration laws back then, and you also have to think about the diagnostic manual back then, it ruled out homosexuality or any perception of homosexuality, right? Because it was considered abnormal. So then you have this hyper heterosexuality with communities that are moving into the US that are not white Eurocentric, right? Historical trauma, those of you who are not aware, these are different things that are happening. So those of you who aren't aware, Watsonville riots, this was when the Filipino men, they were really known as well-dressed guys. They were womanizers. And of course, the white men didn't like that. They didn't like these Filipino guys stealing the girls, that so to speak. And so what they basically lynched these Filipino men, right? And not only that, but they started a rumor that Asian men genitalia was not desirable, right? That it was smaller and which again, really gross stuff that they were trying to perpetuate. And then again, the xenophobia, fearing the unknown, protecting white citizenship in different ways. Other layers, so I mentioned earlier, Chinese American men really built the Transcontinental Railroad, but after that, when the railroad was done, what jobs were left for these Chinese men? Unfortunately, they were given these Asian men were given the jobs that were normally given to women. And so this again is emasculating these Asian men, right? Chinatowns, the history of Chinatowns, basically that's segregation outright. There were very few opportunities for Asian women, and unfortunately, this sex slavery happened. And so of the few Asian women that were allowed to immigrate to the US in the early days, was very much, around sex work. Ajinomoto. I'm not familiar with that, Akila. So yeah, I'll have to learn more about that. Additionally, yeah, chemistry. Modernization and westernization. So here in America, we have this very strict guideline of men are supposed to act this way, women are supposed to act this way. But if you look at other countries and other cultures outside of the US and other times throughout history, there are different ways for men and women and other genders to act, right? There are other Asian cultures and even Native American cultures that had more than two genders. So again, if somebody's coming in from another country, from a third gender, and a third gender is revered and respected, but US immigration laws at that time are very restrictive and saying that homosexuality is a mental disorder. Again, this is quotes. We're already excluding LGBTQ folks from other countries. And if you're into law stuff, this is a really good one to look up. It's a US versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898. Basically, this Wong Kim Ark was a Chinese American guy that was born in the US. And then he took a family trip to China. And at that time, when he was in China, the US started implementing more harsh laws about immigration. So then when he tried to come back into the US, they said, no, we can't accept you because you're Chinese. And he's like, well, wait a minute, I was born here in the US. So this went all the way to the Supreme Court, right? Additionally, a lot of Asian Americans earlier in those days were required to carry 2 forms of identification. Because again, they had to somehow prove that they were here in America. It's like, well, they didn't jump across the Pacific, right? They got here clearly. And then Japanese internment. This is unfortunately, a really bad part of our U.S. history in that Japanese Americans were not given due process and lost their property, lost their generational wealth, and forced into concentration camps. So this data, this pie chart is from Stop AAPI Hate. This is from March 2020 to February 21. And as I mentioned earlier, the stereotypes of what it means to be a woman, what a stereotype of what it means to be Asian, then the stereotypes of what it means to be LGBTQ. They saw a much higher rate of Asian women's self-reporting the anti-Asian hate compared to male-identified folks, or as well as trans and/or non-binary folks as well. And so, what does that look like? And we have this Venn diagram here on the right of, white supremacy, patriarchy, and the white patriarchy, this purity culture, and then on top of that, you have patriarchy of other communities, right? And so this is a diagram is from VELA, which is a nonprofit organization in New Orleans. So if you get a chance to check them out, they do a lot of great work. So VELA, VAYLA, New Orleans. And so they do a lot of great work. They've been organizing a lot, especially after post Katrina. And there's some history there that I could talk about later, but not in this presentation. We'll skip the first one, but basically something to think about. How have you encouraged or discouraged racialized gender stereotypes? So an example could be, I feel uncomfortable when I see a masculine Asian American person expressing something that I think is emasculating. Right? So right there, I'm kind of encouraging an unhealthy idea of what an Asian American man or a male identified person should be acting, right? Another question, what are you doing to break these racialized gender stereotypes? An example could be that you support and celebrate the wide variety of gender expressions that go beyond, white Eurocentric standards, right? And not only that, but thinking about what are your bystander interventions. This is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Bystander intervention is very important, and it doesn't even have to be sexual assault. It could also be, racism, sexism, heterosexism, cissexism, right? How are you going to interrupt harmful behavior? Is it inclusive? So I will acknowledge this for myself. Like, I know what I'm going to do when I hear something racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic. However, I don't feel as confident in myself to stand up when I hear somebody say something ableist, right? Because I don't identify as someone with a disability. I don't feel like I have enough content knowledge to interrupt that behavior. So maybe I don't feel comfortable intervening, right? But I can do other things to intervene. So these are things to think about for your own identities as well as others. So here are some resources. The Asian American Women's Alliance. Oh, this should be a separate bullet point here. NCAPIA, the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Association. I need to separate that bullet point. So NCAPIA is really great in that they actually have public service announcements in different Asian languages, including video, literature, and audio about family is family, right? You know, what does it mean to accept your LGBTQ family member, right? There's also Asian Americans Advancing Justice. There's also this report from the Human Rights Campaign coming out, living authentically as LGBTQ Asian Pacific Islander Americans. They also have a similar report for Hispanic Latino, as well as for Black and African American as well. There's also a map of gender diverse cultures. And I mentioned this earlier. This is, again, giving you context that throughout history and in other countries, there are more than 2 genders that are out there. There we go. And so you can click on that. And I'll go ahead and put this link in the chat. You can click on those different markers and you can see, like here, Samoa, right? There's another gender identity that doesn't fall within female and male, right? You know, even here in America, Native American cultures. There's also NAPOF, the National Association of Pacific American Women's Forum, and there's Stop API Hate. And this is a self-reporting website, and it's also offered in multiple languages as well during these COVID times. As far as references, here are the references that I use. Lots of academic articles, identity development articles as well. Both LGBT as well as Asian American, and then a few that are actually a mix of both. You're welcome to take a screenshot of this if you'd like, or pause the video if you're watching the YouTube. And then, you know, how to find me. Ooh, that turned out pixelated. We do have these Asian gender roles buttons available in the office. So yeah, that is available. We actually have a lot of them for Pride, and we actually ran out of them on Pride at one point. This was pre-pandemic. Any questions, concerns? Hey, explain this. The buttons are cute. Thank you. I had a lot of fun asking my Asian American students, hey, what's a food roll that comes from South Asia? Right. So yeah, sushi rolls, gimbap rolls, spring rolls, summer rolls. I can unmute panelists. Let's see if I can unmute. You're an attendee. Yes. Okay. There we go. Maybe request unmute. Sorry, I'm learning this webinar stuff.
I'm Natasha. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry.
Hi, I was just gonna say, can I talk to you after your presentation is like all over for a minute about tomorrow?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, that's all.
Yeah. Well, I meant to unmute Akila. Sorry, Akila. I'm figuring this out.
Hi.
Yeah. Hey.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure whether it was like something that was, for everybody or not. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And I would love to do this again when we're in person. And because if we're in person, we can do small groups and discussions, but figuring this
Yeah.
out way more.
Yeah. Do they are we having any in-person meetings this semester or?
We have already had a few. Last week or so, we did an interactive social justice timeline to also show that Asian Americans have also been there, but also getting folks to like submit like what do they remember from like history class, right? Or things that they know, right? So looking at the different historical events that have influenced each other. And this was mainly to show that there's no singular social justice movement. We all learn from each other. We also collaborate with each other. So we did that in person last week. And so we're probably going to do that again in the fall.
Okay.
A reminder, Outspoken final meeting of the semester next week is in person. We'll be in the office of the LGBT Student Services building, and I will now stop the live stream.